Hi everybody, this is Bastiaan, and today we're going to take a look at the Portuguese opening. I'll be playing white. The game starts out with e4, e5, and now bishop to b5. And the point of doing so is to prevent black from gaining control of the center immediately with pawns, because of the discovered check of the bishop, and it also prevents the natural development of the knight on c6 unless black is willing to play with double pawns. So black may choose to ignore this bishop and continue develop normally, or he can try and kick it away. So in this game black will try and kick away the bishop with a6. Bishop falls back on a4, b5, again kicking away the bishop, and bishop to b3. Game continues with knight to c6, the natural development square, and already we can see that black is eyeing the outpost on d4, attacking the bishop on b3. There are plenty of ways to continue. White may try a3 for instance, preventing the danger from pawn pushes, and also giving the ability to fall back even further while still controlling the diagonal on the weak f7 square. So that's definitely worth considering. White may try knight to f3 to create counterplay on the pawn on e5. After d4 this will become unprotected, but I am simply going to ignore this threat for now, willing to play with double pawns myself, and I play knight to c3, attacking the pawn on b5, preventing the pawn storms. So if a5 is played, for instance, I can grab a free pawn. If at this point knight to d4 is played, attacking the bishop, I can continue with knight to f3, attacking the pawn on e5, also attacking the knight on d4, with my own knight being protected by the queen. And if knight takes bishop, pawn recaptures, I will have double pawns, but I will have an open a file and an attack on the pawn on e5. And if black tries to protect, say with d6, we can crush right through with knight takes pawn on b5, and we can see that we will create a discovered attack on the rook on a8. So not too worried with playing with double pawns. However, the knight jump wasn't played yet. Black instead plays, well, he could go for a move like queen to g5, taking advantage of the unprotected pawn on g2, but white shouldn't be scared of such a move. After knight to f3, it becomes very dangerous to grab that pawn. If queen takes pawn, for instance, rook to g1, and we can see that there's only one escape square for the queen. Queen to h3, and now a bishop sacrifice. Bishop takes pawn on f7 check, regaining the lost pawn of g2. And of course, if king recaptures, he runs into the fork. Alternatively, if king to e7, we can continue with our knight outposts, knight to d5 check, again the bishop cannot be recaptured because of the fork. Perhaps king to d8, rook to g3, attacking the queen, and we note that there's only one square available to flee to. Queen to h6, d4, queen to d6 perhaps, pawn takes pawn, knight recaptures, bishop takes knight, rook recaptures, bishop to f4, creating a second attacker on the knight on e5, knight takes knight check, queen recaptures, discovered attack on the queen, queen to e6 perhaps, bishop to g5 check, king to e8, and knight takes pawn, and we have a triple fork. So that just goes to show how dangerous it is to grab the pawn on g2 at that point. But none of this was played. So let's go back. Instead of queen to g5, knight to f6 is possible, which wasn't played. Black tries to keep the diagonal open, and he plays bishop to c5 instead, attacking the weak pawn on f2. So now we have threats of queen to f6 or even h4, attacking this pawn. So this has to be responded to immediately, and I play queen to h5, developing the queen before we block it with our knight, allowing checkmate on f7. And we note that there are a few ways to develop the queen. We can move to f3, g4, attacking the pawn on g7, or h5. And the reason why h5 was chosen is because now it is no longer possible to develop the knight naturally, counterattacking the queen. Because if knight to f7, simply checkmate. So this is preferred for the over the development of the queen to f3. Now black may respond with queen to e7, protecting the pawn, after which we can develop our knight to the outpost on d5, threatening the queen and threatening a fork on c7. And the move is not bad, but black wants to avoid that complication. He can go for queen to f6 perhaps, immediately trying to attack the pawn on f2. But after an in-between move, knight develops to f3, and again you're seeing the threat of the knight jump, knight to d5, leading to the same complications, with two attackers on the pawn on e5, perhaps with a check. So instead of developing the queen, g6 was played. And this is a bit of the reason why I've chosen the h5 development, because now I will develop in order to make the g6 pawn a target, even though it is protected twice with pawns. So I violate opening theory a little bit again, moving the strong piece first. So I'll move it twice in a row, and I fall back to f3, having created the weakness on g6. Again, the queen moves are possible. Perhaps queen to f6, knight to d5 once again. Take, and we're looking at a fork on c7, after which bishop to d6 perhaps, and the bishop is locked out of the game. So black doesn't like that. Instead he plays knight to f6, ready to castle. The knight prevents the immediate checkmate on f7, and it is still covered by the queen on d8. We continue with knight g to e2, so we are going to have to move fast now, preventing all ideas of the knight outpost from black, with knight to d4, forking bishop and queen. So nice defensive role for the knight for the moment. Bishop to b7, so black is creating adjacent diagonals for an attack of his own. d3, and the point of which is to activate the bishop, supporting the pawn as well. And after knight to bishop to h6, it will no longer be available for black to castle. And we can see how dangerous it was to advance the pawn, creating a hole on h6. So if black wants to castle, he has to do so now. So black castles. Bishop to h6 anyways. And rook to e8, still protecting the pawn on f7. So it looks like black material wise is doing okay, but white simply continues the attack. Knight to d5, adding a second attacker to the knight. And we note that the king can no longer step in because of the bishop. So if rook e6, for instance, bishop to g5, adding another attacker. So that's perhaps not best. Knight takes knight. Bishop recaptures, renewing the threat of the mate on f7. Finally, the queen is forced to step in. Queen to e7, protecting the pawn, but also covering the f6 square after queen to f6 with a checkmate. No longer worried for forks with the knight on c7. And now again we have to be fast, so I'm not going to waste my time castling. h4, once again trying to exploit the weakness of the pawn on g6. So black would like to play something active here, but if he plays something like knight b4, creating two attackers on the bishop, threatening a fork, we can see that after bishop takes bishop, knight takes pawn, check, king to d2 perhaps, knight takes rook, bishop takes rook, rook takes bishop, rook takes knight, white will be up a minor piece. So the attack has to be prepared, and after the h4 move, black plays rook a to b8, protecting the bishop. Now with threats, of course, of knight to b4. But I continue simply with the pawn push, pawn to h5. And if knight to b4 at this point, we can simply fall back, still creating the threat on the pawn on f7 and protecting the pawn on c2. And if after, say, d5, we can kick away the knight, knight retreats, and white will simply have a free pawn on d5. Alternatively, if not d5 is played, but a5, I can grab the pawn, and we can see that black's attack has come too late. Pawn to a4, bishop takes, check, queen recaptures check, king h8, and g7 checkmate. If alternatively no pawn push is played, but pawn takes pawn at this point, we can step in with the queen, queen to g3 check, king to h8, and we get a mate this way. So black has come to realize his attack after h4, preparing with rook on b8, will not come in time. So h5, and now black has to play the awkward move g5, and we note that this pawn can no longer be protected by other pawns, the h pawn being blocked by the bishop and the f pawn being blocked by the pin. So queen to f5, still threatening on f7, but now you're also threatening bishop takes pawn on g5, taking out black's most important pawn, also with tempo with an attack on the queen. And this cannot be prevented. Game continues with knight to d4, so black desperately tries to get rid of some material, attacking the queen and the bishop on d5. And black is hoping I would play something like queen takes pawn check, queen recaptures, bishop recaptures, bishop recaptures, pawn takes bishop, and perhaps knight takes pawn with a fork, leaving the advantage for black. But of course this isn't played. After knight to d4, our defensive knight steps into the action. Knight takes knight. So I'm up a minor piece. Black may recapture, but recapturing the knight is a mistake, after which white can play bishop takes pawn on g5, attacking the queen, and if queen to d6, perhaps we get the check leading to the mate. So the queen still has to be able to protect the pawn on f7, and if queen to f8, bishop to f6, and we are threatening a check on g5, which will lead to the loss of the queen. So if we go back, the knight cannot be recaptured. Bishop is recaptured instead. Bishop takes pawn, attacking the queen, and perhaps it's best for black to try some counterplay, perhaps with bishop to e6, but this will simply lose another pawn. Queen takes pawn, still attacking the queen, attacking the pawn on c7, and perhaps the bishop on c5, also protecting the knight on d4. So the move wasn't played, and instead black tries queen to f8, still protecting the pawn on e7. So black is down a pawn. I continue with bishop to f6, ignoring the threat of the knight on d4, because we can throw in a check and gain the queen or get a checkmate. So if e takes on d, for instance, queen g5 check, bishop, queen blocks, queen takes checkmate. So instead queen to h6 is played to cover the g5 square against check, but we continue the check with queen to g4, and now we see we have two pieces hanging, the knight and the bishop, but the check has to be responded to, and there are no good squares available for black to do so. King moves out of the way, bishop to g5, attacking the queen, and there are three squares available for the queen to flee to. If say queen to g7, then knight to f4, attacking the queen. If queen to g8, bishop to h6, and black will lose the queen and get mated. So that cannot be played. Queen to h8, same problem. Bishop to h6, and the queen is forced to block. So retreating to g7 doesn't seem like the best option. He can try the d6 square, after which knight to f5 threatens the queen and locks out the e7 square for escape of the king. Queen to b6 then perhaps, bishop to e7 check, rook recaptures, queen to g7 check, king flees, and we get the checkmate the next move with queen to g8. So both of those squares don't seem interesting. Black goes to b6, avoiding the tempo with the knight move and creating some threats of his own. So there are now three pieces attacking the knight on d4, and black hopes to take advantage of the fact that I didn't castle with bishop takes on e2 with check and tempo. But we don't care and play knight to e5, willing to lose some tempo and lose a pawn. Bishop takes pawn check, king to e2, and unfortunately for black, he can no longer step in with the queen because that square is now covered by the knight. Now, if a random move is played, let's say a5, the game may continue with bishop to e7 check, rook recaptures, and we get our mate, as seen before. So random moves can no longer be played. If bishop to e6, perhaps to create some counterplay, bishop to h6 check is a checkmate. So that's also impossible. Black tries f6, counterattacking the bishop on g5, his own bishop still being under attack, with some breathing room for the king on f8. So bishop to h6 check, king goes to the f7 square. Now the queen steps in with queen to g7 check, forcing king to e6. And finally now we take on the bishop on d5 with tempo, pawn takes bishop check. And black would love to take out the knight on f5 and then step in with the queen on e3, but he realizes he cannot do so, because if king takes on the knight, one move g4 is a checkmate. So black must take on the pawn instead, only other move. We continue the checks with queen takes pawn on d7. There are only two moves available. Queen to d6 will lose the queen. Or he can play king to c5. So king to c5. And now we notice that we have a nice diagonal to attack king and queen with bishop to e3. Unfortunately, this is not possible because this bishop is still covering that square. So I'm going to take out the bishop, perhaps suffering a check and a loss of tempo with a discovered check. Now black may try some counterplay with rook to d8 instead, after which bishop to e3 check, king to b4 perhaps, bishop takes queen. And this is a simple trade-off because the bishop is blocking both squares of the escape from the enemy king. So if rook takes queen, a3 check, king to a4, b3 will be the checkmate. So counterplay wasn't played. King to b4, discover check instead. Bishop to e3 to block and attack the queen. Black may try queen to b7 to get out of the check, but a3, king a5, b4 check, king a4, now queen to f7, and mate can no longer be prevented. So that's perhaps not best. After bishop to e3, rook b to d8 for the counterplay, a3 check, king a5, attacking the queen, and we can now see that we can grab the queen with tempo, checking the enemy king, after which we can bring our queen to safety. But of course we're not going to do that. Instead we play knight to d4, and this move looks very weird for white, because we are blocking the attack on the enemy queen. We are allowing an attack on the knight, perhaps even a sacrifice against the bishop, and an attack on our own queen. But if, say, pawn takes knight is played, we get the check on d2. We note that there's no longer a discovered check on the king on f2. b4 perhaps, pawn takes pawn, double check and mate, with this square being covered by the queen. Alternatively, if not pawn takes knight, but b4 is played, hoping to block the check, which now has become available because the knight is blocking the discovered check. Knight to b3 will be the checkmate. So that won't work either. If queen takes knight, queen takes pawn, check, king to a4, and b4, b3 rather, will be the checkmate. But the move that was played was rook takes on queen, bishop to d2, pawn blocks, and pawn takes pawn, with the knight covering the escape on b5, double check and mate. So we note that the knight move was important, because if you would have played something else like king to e2 for instance, and then go for the check, after rook takes queen, bishop check, b4, pawn takes pawn, double check, we notice that we have created or left an escape square for the enemy king. So I hope you enjoyed watching this game using the Portuguese opening. Thanks for watching and have a great evening.